What's the scariest thing that's ever happened to you in real life? When I was a kid, I used to be a sleepwalker. We lived in a pretty rough neighborhood in Decatur, Georgia. Several times, I woke up right in the middle of the street in the dead of night without having the slightest clue how I had gotten there. The worst part was having to walk back home alone and entering through the front door that I had left wide open, exposing myself to anyone who might be lurking in the darkness. However, the time that scared me the most happened when I was about 9 years old. I woke up suddenly and found myself standing up, with my bedroom curtains pulled back, staring intently out the window. As I regained consciousness, I realized something terrifying. On the other side of the glass, there was a massive man, completely bald. He had no hair, no eyebrows, nothing. He was staring directly at me, moving his face closer and closer to mine, inch by inch. He had this look of total confusion, as if he wasn't quite sure what he was looking at. The moment I understood what was happening, I began to scream uncontrollably. I was frozen in place, feeling the fear cause me to wet myself. The man panicked. He let out a high-pitched shriek, did a strange maneuver like some kind of somersault, and went running away in a zigzag pattern, as if he were trying to dodge bullets. My mother woke up, but she thought I had simply had a nightmare. It wasn't until the next morning that we found a screwdriver on the front porch and clear damage to the door frame and the lock. He was trying to break in. Nowadays, I still almost wet myself when I tell this story, but now it is usually from laughing. I will never forget the expression on his face when I came back to life and started screaming, or his high-pitched cry, or how he rolled on the ground and then fled, dodging imaginary bullets all the way down the street. I know that, compared to the stories of serial killers or movie psychopaths we usually hear around here, mine might seem simple, but I swear, if you close your eyes and try to put yourself in my shoes for a second, you'll understand why I still feel a chill when someone walks too close behind me. I was 12 years old. Back then, I was a small girl, even for my age. I barely weighed 90 pounds, and my height didn't intimidate anyone. I was with my father in a shopping district, one of those places with wide sidewalks and lots of movement. My dad had stopped to look at something in a window or to take a phone call. I don't remember well, but I walked a few steps ahead. That's when I saw him. He was a massive man. I'm not just talking about height, though. He was impressive, easily standing over 1.5 feet taller than me, but his presence. He was a human mountain in a frayed jacket that was too small for him. As he crossed the street, I saw a $1 bill slip out of his pocket and fall to the ground. He didn't notice, he just kept walking with a heavy, erratic pace. Being a polite child, my first instinct was to help. I picked up the bill, ran across the street, and caught up to him. "Sir, you dropped this," I said, holding out my small hand with the crumpled bill. He stopped dead in his tracks and turned around. Seeing him up close, I froze. His eyes wouldn't focus. They moved with a strange speed, darting from side to side. He thanked me several times. It was obvious he wasn't well, that his mind lived in a place very different from ours. I felt a pang of pity, but also an urgent desire to turn around and get back to my father. Just as I was about to say goodbye, it happened. Without saying a single word, without changing his empty expression, the man reached out his hand. It wasn't an aggressive or fast movement. It was almost casual, like someone reaching for a piece of fruit on a shelf. But his hand was gigantic. He grabbed me firmly by the top of my head, digging his fingers into my hair and pressing my skull downward. I was paralyzed. The world became small. All I could see were his knees and the pavement. I tried to pull back, but he wouldn't let go. He wasn't squeezing with the intent to hurt me, but his strength was such that I was nothing more than an object in his hands. I felt the weight of his body through that grip. It was a feeling of absolute helplessness. I was a 90-pound girl trapped by a stranger who didn't even seem aware that he was hurting me. It was only a few seconds, but in my mind, they lasted for hours. The silence of that man while he held my head was the most terrifying part. Fortunately, my father hadn't taken his eyes off me. Before the fear turned into total panic, I felt other hands. They were my father's, who reached my side with that tense calm only parents have in a crisis. He didn't shout. He didn't look for a fight. He knew the man wasn't in his right mind. He simply took me by the shoulders, lifted me almost off the ground to break the grip, and guided me away with a firm pace. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if the man was still standing there with his hand reached out, or if he was following us. I only remember the relief of feeling the air again, and the strange sensation of heat that remained on the crown of my head for the rest of the day. That was the first time I understood that. Sometimes, danger doesn't come with a knife or a scream, but with a silent hand that simply decides not to let you go. I was on active duty in the Navy, serving on a submarine. One day, we were in port, and almost the entire crew had gone ashore. Those of us on the night shift were allowed to bring our kids on board for dinner. Everything was going great. The kids were having a blast. Until right in the middle of dinner, an announcement came over the 4MC, that's the emergency loudspeaker system. They called out, "Light smoke in the engine room," and immediately after, "Fire in the engine room." We were all trained for this, so we went into autopilot. But the craziest thing was seeing one of our most senior chief petty officers. He ran toward the children, grabbed them, and literally started throwing them up through the scuttle to the commander, who was up top, catching them to get them safely onto the deck. It was a surreal sight, seeing those kids flying through the hatch. But it worked. The rest of us ran toward the fire. In the rush, I noticed no one was grabbing oxygen masks, so I grabbed a bunch of them, put mine on, and headed down. When I entered the engine room, there was a mist. Yes, but it didn't smell like smoke. It smelled sweet, a strange, sickly sweet scent. It turns out an oil pump had burst, and it had filled the entire back aft with atomized hydraulic fluid. The terrifying part is that, at that exact moment, a guy was about to light a cutting torch for a repair. If he had been a single second slower in hearing that alarm, we would have ended up in an absolute inferno. If he hadn't heard the announcement and had lit that torch while we were all inside, we would have all been blown to pieces before we could even blink. In the end, everything turned out fine. We had to clean oil off absolutely everything and fix the pump, but it was a death scare. You realize just how close you were to it all ending very badly, just because of a simple stroke of luck. This happened when I was 11 years old, and honestly, I believe my brain changed forever that day. I was home alone. My mom had gone out, and I had just fallen asleep on the living room sofa. I don't know how much time passed, but I was awakened by a sound that anyone who lives in a house recognizes instantly. Someone was forcing the front door handle. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then came the banging. They were sharp, heavy blows. Someone was trying to kick the door down. A panic hit me that I can't even describe. As best I could, I grabbed the phone, dialed 911, and ran to the kitchen. I crawled into the pantry and curled into a ball on the bottom shelf, hiding behind cereal boxes and cans. The worst part came next. The pantry shared a wall with the side entrance of the house. I heard the men moving outside, and they started banging on that door too. They were inches away from me. Only a wooden board and a cheap lock separated us. I remember covering my mouth with both hands so they wouldn't hear my breathing. while the 911 operator told me over the phone that the police were already on their way. When the patrol cars arrived, everything became a chaos of lights and shouting outside. One of the officers entered the house to find me. When he opened the pantry door and saw me tucked in there, he simply picked me up and carried me. He didn't let go for a single second. He held me in his arms the entire time until my mom got home. I was in shock. I didn't want to let go of him for anything in the world. And that officer stayed there with me, making sure I felt safe until the very last minute. I'm 27 years old now, and that day marked me for life. I almost never stay home alone. It's something I just can't handle well. In fact, the same day I signed the lease for my first apartment, the very first thing I did was go out and get a dog. I needed to know there was another living being with me, someone who would alert me if they heard anything. When something like that happens to you when you are that young, the sense of security in your own home disappears, and no matter how many years pass, it is incredibly hard to get it back. I have a story about this that even now, decades later, is still hard for me to process. I wasn't in any real danger, at least not from a criminal, but what my parents did in the name of wisdom and safety was absolute madness. It was the early 80s. I was only 5 years old. My parents had just taught me the basic survival facts, my address, my dad's work number, and 911. So far, everything was normal. The problem was the final exam they came up with. They actually took the time to record a fake cassette tape. It started with normal music, but then the music would cut out to make way for a breaking news report they had recorded themselves. The announcer said that a very dangerous killer had escaped from the local prison and that he had last been seen lurking in our neighborhood. One day, they told me they were going for a quick walk around the block and left me home alone. Before leaving, they started the tape. I was just sitting there playing when the music stopped and I heard the news about the killer. I froze. But that wasn't all. To make sure it was realistic, my dad disconnected the house phone line before they walked out. A few minutes after the news report on the tape ended, my dad came back to the house. But he didn't just walk in. He started pounding on the front door with brute force, shaking the frame and screaming indistinguishable things, as if someone were trying to kick the door down to come in and kill me. I was a 5-year-old child. I couldn't reach the peephole on the door, and the windows were way too high. I was absolutely terrified. My first instinct was to run to the landline to call 911, but when I picked up the receiver, the line was dead. That silence on the phone was what scarred me the most. I felt completely alone in the world, and I thought I was going to die. When the exercise finally ended, my parents walked in very calmly to analyze my reaction and talk to me about what I had learned and how to stay safe. According to them, it was a valuable lesson, so I would know what to do in an emergency. The reality is, they traumatized me. I spent years having nightmares about the sound of the door being pounded on and that fake cassette tape. Today I tell the story, and it sounds like a bad joke, but at that moment, for a 5-year-old boy, it was the most terrifying experience of his life. I guess I learned a lesson, but at the cost of losing the sense of security in my own home for a very long time. There was a time in my life that feels like it was ripped straight out of a crime movie, but for me, it was just my daily reality. It was when I lived with my dad during the worst of his opioid addiction. When you live with an addict, your house stops being a home and turns into a waiting room for very dangerous people. My dad and my uncle used to get pills and weed from a guy my old man only called the devil. He would literally say things like, "I'm going to the devil's house to get some weed," or "The devil is coming over." He never explained why he called him that, but the nickname wasn't a joke. One day, In a moment of clarity, or maybe just paranoia, he looked at me very seriously and said, "If that guy finds out I talked to you about him, he'll kill all of us. Your stepmother, you, and me. It's not a threat. It's a fact." That was the level of people my dad surrounded himself with. And looking back, it brings to mind another situation with one of those clients or partners that left me chilled to the bone when I finally learned the truth. I was about 17 years old and I was home alone. A guy showed up in an old truck and told me he was there to look at a truck my dad wanted to sell. Being a naive teenager, I went out and chatted with him for a while as he inspected the vehicle. The guy didn't say anything weird or aggressive, but he had something about him. He was out of it, with a vacant stare and slow movements. In that environment, it was normal to assume he was just high. That was the kind of person who visited my father all the time. We talked for about 10 minutes about engines and prices, and then he left. When my dad got home later and I told him the truck buyer had stopped by, his face completely changed. He went pale. "He was supposed to come when I was here," he told me, in a voice I had never heard before. Then he dropped the bomb. "That guy is out of his mind. He spent years in prison for murdering a girl, and he didn't just kill her. He mutilated the body, cut off her head. He did horrible things I don't even want to tell you about." I went cold. I remembered how I had turned my back on him while he looked at the engine, how he laughed at some dumb joke. I had been alone, vulnerable, with a sadist with a history of mutilation while my dad was away. The only thing I could think of at that moment, and what I ask myself to this day, is why on earth do you get involved with people like that? When drugs enter a house, they don't just bring substances, they bring monsters into your living room, and they force you to shake their hand. I've told this before, but it fits perfectly here. During the 12 years I spent at my last job, I always parked in the exact same spot. It was a space open to the public, but the company asked us to use the back of the lot to leave the front spaces for customers. Everyone knew that was my spot. One day, when I arrived, my spot was taken by a Cadillac with blacked-out windows. I was annoyed immediately. It was 4 in the morning, so it couldn't be a customer, and I knew my co-workers' cars. Was it a rookie? Someone from another store in the plaza? I didn't know. The car was still there during my lunch break, when I went home, and for the next 2 days as well. There was something about that car that deeply unsettled me. It smelled bad. Literally bad. We are in the South. It was the middle of summer, and God knows what was cooking inside there under the sun. My dad was a Marine and later a police officer. He always said that if you feel something is wrong, it probably is. I called the non-emergency police number. I felt like an idiot, but every time I passed near that car, my nerves betrayed me. I had to wait over an hour for them to arrive. If I hadn't had the next day off, I probably would have given up. But I stayed there, mostly out of stubbornness. That was my spot, and I wanted that piece of junk out of there. When the police arrived, they were annoyed. I can only imagine how many calls they get a day about poorly parked cars. But as soon as they ran the plates, everything went crazy. They started asking for my information. They wanted to talk to my manager. They asked about the cameras and if I had touched the vehicle. It turns out the car was linked to an Amber Alert. It was the last vehicle where a missing minor, a 15-year-old girl, had been seen. When they opened the trunk, they found her mutilated body under a blanket. That's where the smell was coming from. She had been dating her boyfriend, a much older and controlling guy, and she tried to end the relationship. She made the mistake of getting into the car with him one last time. He drove 3 counties away, tortured her, put her in there, and simply abandoned the car to leave her to die. I never knew the exact time of her death, and that haunts me. Sometimes I think that if I had made a scene from the first day, maybe she would be alive. Listen to your gut, even when you feel like you're just being stubborn or a nuisance. Cultural note. The Amber Alert is a missing child emergency alert system implemented in the United States in 1996. It was named in honor of Amber Hagerman, a 9-year-old girl who was abducted and murdered in Texas that same year. The name also serves as a backronym for America's Missing Broadcast Emergency Response. It was created through a collaboration between law enforcement and radio broadcasters to spread information massively and immediately. This allows the community to assist in locating minors in imminent danger before it is too late. We moved into that old house when I was about 9 years old. In the neighborhood, we nicknamed it Red Roof because it was the only home in the area with that color. For us kids, it was an easy landmark. Meet me at the Red Roof to play. But what started as an innocent reference soon turned into a nightmare that took me years to overcome. It was a very poor neighborhood, the kind of place where the power goes out all the time, or, as in our case when we moved in, we didn't even have electricity yet. The first night, my mom and I were in the living room. We didn't have a TV, just one of those portable DVD players people used in cars with a tiny screen. We were watching it next to a candle we had placed on a shelf for some light. Out of nowhere, the candle was sent flying toward us, as if someone had thrown it with force from the shelf. That was the first sign that we were not alone. A week later, while I was trying to focus on my homework for my new school, my mom started deep cleaning the kitchen. The refrigerator had come with the house. It was an old, noisy model. As she wiped the top of it, my mom felt something heavy and metallic. When she pulled it down, she froze. It was a rusted machete. Being from the islands, machetes are common tools, so she just shrugged it off, put it back, and decided to ignore it. "It's just an old tool," she told me, but I saw how her hands were shaking. We had a cat, Mishka. She was super adventurous, but she flat out refused to go down into the basement. We didn't go down there either. The vibe coming from that place was horrible. My mom only peeked in once and said it looked like a place where time had frozen. She saw a spider dried up in the middle of its web, and dead mice in strange positions, as if something had stopped them dead in their tracks while they were running. What finally made my mom lose it was the coffee stain in my bedroom. She tried scrubbing it with bleach, with detergent, with everything, but it wouldn't come out. On the contrary, the stain seemed to seep through the paint, getting larger. My mom worked in the medical field, and in a moment of total silence, she stared at the patterns of the stain. That's when she realized it wasn't coffee. It was old blood, bleeding through the layers of paint. We called the police, and an investigation was launched. It turns out that in that house, years ago, an elderly woman had been murdered. She had been stabbed multiple times with that very same machete my mom found on top of the fridge. The killer never took the weapon, he simply hid it up high, where no one would look. The most disgusting part was finding out that, after the crime, nothing was professionally cleaned. They just painted over the blood spatters on the walls of my bedroom. The name Red Roof took on a completely different meaning for us that day. They came to bless the house with a priest, but we didn't stay to see if it worked. We packed the little we had, and we got out of there as fast as we could. I was with him for a couple of years before I realized he had started using meth, like it was some kind of after-work hobby. We already had 1,000 problems, but that was the final straw. I have 3 small children, so I didn't think twice, and I kicked him out of the house. It was the right decision, but it was also the start of my worst nightmare. A few days later, maybe a week, I got a friend request on Facebook from a suspicious account. As soon as I clicked on the profile, my heart stopped. There were no landscape photos or memes. There were only posts about killing me and my children, about his own suicide, and graphic details of how he planned to do it that very day. But what sent me into a total panic was the most recent post. It was a selfie of him in my own backyard. It wasn't an old photo. The angle and the light showed that he had been standing there just minutes ago. The request reached me just as I was driving home with the kids, late at night, out of pure instinct. The day before, I had stopped by my parents' house to pick up my dad's 9mm handgun because I had heard rumors that he was saying he would burn my house down with me inside. I called the police as soon as I pulled into my driveway, terrified to even get out of the car. We live in the middle of the woods, in an isolated area where the police are almost non-existent. I explained everything to them, the death threats, the photo in my yard, but they told me it wasn't that big of a deal, and that they didn't have any patrols available to come check the house before we went inside. There I was, alone in the darkness of the woods, with 3 small children in the back seat, and the police turning their backs on me. I had to make a choice. I made the children stay in the locked car. I gave my oldest son clear instructions on what to do if he heard gunshots, or if I didn't come back out, drive away and don't look back. With my heart slamming against my ribs and the 9mm in my hand, I had to enter my own dark house. I went room by room, checking behind doors, inside closets, and under beds, expecting to find him in any corner with a knife or something worse. It was the most terrifying moment of my life. For months, that was our routine. Every time we got home, I had to do a sweep of the entire house looking for him while my kids waited outside. During those searches, my thoughts also told me there was a possibility he was outside stalking my children. I lived with a constant fear that, eventually, I would find him there, waiting for me. I called the police many more times, until finally, weeks later, and after constant death threats, they granted me a restraining order. He died about a year ago. A lot of people expect you to feel sorry when someone you knew passes away, but I didn't feel any of that. I only felt an immense relief. For the first time in years, I was able to walk into my house and turn on the light without having to grip a weapon. A little less than a year ago, at 2 o'clock in the morning, my life changed forever. There were no warnings, no previous pain, nothing. I simply woke up screaming in pure agony. It felt as if someone had driven a hunting knife into the middle of my chest and was twisting it without mercy. That was the beginning of a 45-day ordeal, in and out of the hospital. What initially seemed controllable began to worsen in a terrifying way. In a matter of weeks, one of my lungs partially collapsed, and I contracted a pneumonia that almost took me out. There were moments when the simple act of inhaling felt like trying to breathe through a narrow straw underwater. I was on the verge of being permanently connected to an oxygen tank. The emergency room doctor who treated me that first night told me something that still gives me goosebumps. "You are incredibly lucky that the pain woke you up." Since then, every specialist I've seen has told me the same thing. If I had kept sleeping, I most likely would have never woken up. After dozens of tests, they finally found the culprit. I have a rare autoimmune disease. Basically, my own body sees my red blood cells as enemies and attacks them, causing them to clump together and form clots out of nowhere. It's like having a factory of death traps inside my veins. Now, my reality is different. I'm going to have to take warfarin, a very strong blood thinner, for the rest of my days. Also, the damage to my right lung is permanent. Normal things like climbing stairs or walking fast leave me exhausted and gasping for air. Sometimes I get frustrated that I can't be the person I was before. But then I remember that scream at 2 in the morning. My chest hurts. When I take a deep breath, Yes, but I'm here to tell the story, and that is much more than the statistics said I would get. Cultural note. A pulmonary embolism refers to a sudden blockage in one of the pulmonary arteries. Usually, it occurs when a blood clot breaks loose from another part of the body, such as the legs, and travels through the bloodstream until it lodges in the lungs, cutting off the oxygen flow. It is one of the most silent and lethal medical emergencies in existence. There are rare conditions, such as antiphospholipid syndrome (APS), where the immune system mistakenly creates proteins that drastically increase blood clotting. It is often referred to as sticky blood. Warfarin is an anticoagulant drug used to thin the blood and prevent these life-threatening clots from forming. My story is strangely similar to the previous one, but with a twist that sounds like a very absurd miracle. I was 19 years old. At the time, I was your typical kid with health anxiety. I worried about every spot on my skin or every strange twitch. The irony is that when death actually came looking for me, it didn't give me a single warning symptom. I was home alone, relaxing, when suddenly I felt violent palpitations in my chest. They didn't last more than 30 seconds. The next thing I remember is waking up on the floor, disoriented, not knowing how much time had passed. It turns out, I suffered what doctors call a saddle pulmonary embolism, or a saddle PE. It is the most lethal type of clot that exists. In fact, for the vast majority of people, the first and only symptom is sudden death. Period. There is no time to call an ambulance. The only reason I am writing this today is because of pure physics when I blacked out. I fell flat on my back against the floor. The impact was so precise and so hard that it managed to displace the clot just enough for my heart to start pumping blood again. Basically, the floor gave me the resuscitation I needed. I spent 5 days in the intensive care unit, the ICU, and another week on the recovery floor. They did everything to me. 7 different types of scans, 2 angiograms, and they pumped me with such a massive amount of clot-dissolving medication that my blood practically turned into water. It was a disaster. I started having hemorrhages in my eyes, and to top it off, I discovered in the worst possible way that I was allergic to morphine. I almost died from the medication before the clot could finish the job. The day I was discharged, the entire ICU staff came down to say goodbye. They told me, half joking and half serious, "Thanks for not dying." The most disturbing part is that I had no risk factors. I didn't smoke. I wasn't sedentary. Nothing. To this day, they have no idea why it happened. I'm 22 now, and I'm stuck taking a maximum dose of blood thinners for the rest of my life. But the craziest thing is that my health anxiety disappeared. I realized that spending years worrying about diseases did nothing, because when I was actually about to die, I didn't feel it coming. So now, I just live. Sometimes, life is just that random. Cultural note. What is a saddle? PE. It is an extreme emergency where a large blood clot lodges exactly at the bifurcation of the main pulmonary artery. It is called a saddle because the clot sits over the division leading to both lungs, like a saddle, blocking blood flow to both sides simultaneously. Risk of sudden death. Unlike smaller clots that cause progressive pain or shortness of breath, a saddle PE can cause instant cardiovascular collapse. It is one of the few medical conditions where fainting is often the final event. High-impact anticoagulants, the medications mentioned in the story known as thrombolytics, are clot busters. They are so potent that the risk of internal bleeding is extremely high, which explains why the narrator experienced hemorrhages in the capillaries of the eyes. This happened to me a few years ago in a pretty rough part of Phoenix. I was out with some friends, just hanging out, when we started hearing some strange moaning. It was a weak voice, sounding exhausted, saying help every now and then. We walked closer to see what was going on, and found a guy lying on the ground. His shirt was soaked in blood, and the most shocking part, he had one hand placed over a knife that seemed to be stuck deep in his abdomen. The guy was staring right at us, writhing in pain, and he wouldn't stop saying, "Help me, for God's sake, I'm going to die, please." To be honest, we were terrified. We told him to stay calm, and that we were going to call an ambulance right away. As soon as we mentioned the ambulance, the guy didn't like that idea at all. "No, don't call 911, he shouted. "Just help me yourselves. I'm going to die." It seemed very suspicious to us that someone with a knife in their gut wouldn't want medical help. So we called anyway. The moment my friend started talking to the operator, the guy jumped to his feet. Just like that. He stood up perfectly. With his blood-soaked shirt and the knife in his hand, he screamed a "son of a bitch" at us, and took off running like an athlete. The guy was running in a zigzag pattern down the street as if he were escaping from someone, and he disappeared in seconds. In the end, we were just standing there with the phone in our hands, wondering if it was a setup to get us close and rob us, meaning the blood was fake, or if he was a wanted criminal who, despite his injuries, preferred to flee rather than be treated by an ambulance and later arrested at the hospital.